All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annika Bennett, and I currently serve as the vice president for our student chapter. Really excited to see our chapter leadership and lots of familiar faces today for this webinar. And certainly our guest speaker, who is Dr. Owens. He's a faculty member of in the OLL department, also the department director. Program director. So we're really excited to hear him speak about a very important topic, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And something else I think I'd like to promote here is the Cardinal podcast that he has created in collaboration with Dr. Andrew McCart. And I believe episodes air every Friday. Is that correct?
Well, right. For season 2 is on Mondays at 9:30.
Okay, well, season 2, you guys started Monday at 9:30. So be sure to chime in there. I will actually post the link in the chat if you're interested. I think they have all of the past episodes on the website. So without further ado, do you want to say a couple other words, or do we want to just get started?
Let's just get started. I think as I've learned from Dr. McCart, the best topic I like talking about is myself. So that we won't have a problem with that. And the second best topic is the OLL, and then obviously within that we'll get into our DEI process, and we'll get everything rocking and rolling with that. And I would, by the way, if anyone on here wants to be on the podcast, I am all about interviewing. Season 2 is really more about reality stories. And so we have talked to a lot of students, former graduates. I think so far everyone has been an OLL alum except for Dr. Buckley, who obviously is over the Mahia, so that's the Master of Arts in Higher Education Administration. But I mean, she's connected, right? So the reality is, so far everyone has been OLL connected. So it's all about success stories. Tell me about your journey. Tell them what you feel about leadership, what you've learned, how you're learning, and what you like and don't like. And, we're just highlighting you. So no matter if you think, well, I'm just a freshman, I'm sophomore, junior, it doesn't matter, right? If you're in the program, you're doing great things, and we want to highlight that at any level. So it doesn't matter what college you're connected to. It can be you're in College of Business, College of Education, College of Engineering. So College of Business is going to be on here shortly. The College of Education is going to be on here shortly. Trying to get arts and sciences, it's a little more difficult, but it's going to happen, I promise you. So, but that's just a little bit about the podcast. But as far as OLL, it's about organizational leadership and learning. And that's what it comes down to. One of our biggest monikers is, do you want to learn to lead with, well, I've added after the podcast, do you want to learn to lead with empathy? And I think that was one thing that we learned in season 1. Most of our leaders wanted to learn how to lead with empathy, or talked about leading with empathy, expertise, and compassion. And so I think those are 3 critical things. But in my own personal experience, just giving a highlight. So I work as a consultant with Wright Pat Air Force Base, which is in the state of Ohio. So it's kind of like the Air Force headquarters, so to speak. And I work with him as a consultant for DEI. And I work with Dr. Campbell, who is a colleague of mine. We have a mutual friend, Dr. Ray Forbes, at Franklin University. And she knew that if I was a product of Dr. Forbes, and Dr. Forbes spoke highly of me, she wanted to consult with me for DEI matters at Wright Pat Air Force Base. For those of you who don't know, the Air Force, they haven't always been in the best light when it comes to DEI matters. And so, and there's one specific region, which is what they call the AFRO, which is Air Force Research Lab, which has never really been all that diverse. And trust me, they have spent more money trying to make it, but it's just one of those fields. I think STEM in general, right? Colleges across America have figured out that STEM is just not always the easiest field for minorities or underserved people to not only want to major in, but it's not something that it's always presented as what I call, I have a marketing background. It's not a sexy major, right? There's not a lot of grit. We can promote the pay, but sometimes it's the job in and of itself of being a scientist or being a manufacturing engineer. Those just really, they don't sound real appealing as entrepreneur, right? You could be the next Jeff Bezos, right? Or you Elon Musk, you can create a car, right? Like, so it just it loses some appeal to say, yeah, I'm a manufacturing engineer. Even though you can make great money, it just loses some of that appeal. And so working with them, has been interesting and amazing as a consultant, and saying this is where the Air Force needs to go, and how to improve some of its diversity relations, its equity relations, its inclusion practices, and all those things. And so we don't really, because it is working with the military, I don't always get into the justice. So if you use the acronym JEDI, I don't always get into the justice piece, because from a military perspective, it's really hard for them to be advocates. They can't really be lobbyists. They can kind of make their expressions known, but not really. You're never going to see anyone, do a protest on a military installation without probably some severe consultation. They won't probably lose their career, but it could definitely be a mark against them. And that's because that's not what they're there for. But I also know that working with other outside entities, justice is a huge thing. Working with student athletes, working with students, right? Having social justice is huge and very important. And I think that moving forward is very important. So from a DEI perspective, I know a lot. I know enough to be really dangerous, but also know when to pull back on the reins. So sometimes I see Dr. Hurd out here. I'm an avid horse rider, so I know when to pull back on the reins, and I know when to giddy up and go and to move as fast as possible, forging ahead. So is there anything that you guys wanted me to answer specifically before I kind of jumped into my spiel?
I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the DICE track, since that's something that is that was just recently added to the OLL program, and if we have maybe someone listening who's interested in the OLL program and then specifically in that track, since that is diversity, equity, and inclusion related. So if you could just provide a quick overview, might be helpful.
Yeah, so no, listen, I love talking about DICE. I got to help be on the groundwork for it, which was amazing. So DICE is what is DICE, right? It stands for diversity, inclusion, community engagement, and equity. It was one of those things that we felt that we needed to add to community engagement piece, because it's great to be a diverse organization or to understand diversity. What I call is just the analytics, right? Diversity is just the analytics. It's how many XYZ do you have in your company? How many males, how many females, how many men, how many women, how many blacks, how many whites, Latinx, yada, 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 yada. So you just go down the line, and then diversity just tells you that. So we wanted to definitely bring that to the piece. We felt that it was important. We also felt that inclusion was important. Clearly, you want to make sure, because the way I look at inclusion is making sure you have all the right voices at the table. For many times in many organizations, and even organizations I've worked with, we always ask the question, is everybody at the table? Because the worst thing you want to do is roll out something and figure out that you've offended somebody, you've hurt somebody, or worst case scenario, you left IT off and you can't, you don't have the software or the system to push out the product. So inclusion is really important. The next thing is community engagement. From an organizational side, a lot of times we call that CSR, or your corporate social responsibility. It's understanding how do you connect with your community, or what community do you want to connect with, right? Understanding that. And so we felt that was important. And then obviously equity. Are you doing what's best for everyone? Is it equitable practice? Are you looking at your maternity leave as well as your paternity leave? Are you making sure that when we look across whatever your audience is, that you're represented in that audience? You know what I mean? You don't want to be in an organization or within an operation where you serve mostly, the Latinx community, but yet you don't have any Latinx people on your board or helping you drive or direct and make some of those decisions. So one thing that I think that is most important about our DICE track is you'll walk away, hopefully, with the ability to assist upper management or be that leader in your organization to help them make the best decisions moving forward for 2021 being an organization. So the DICE track is really about that. It's looking at, and two of the classes that we look at, we created a course in anti-racism, understanding and knowing that obviously our president, Dr. Neely Benaputi, wants the University of Louisville to be the premier institution when it comes to anti-racism. So we felt that in creating our new courses, two of the new courses that go along with the DICE track, we knew one of them had to be an anti-racism course. And the anti-racism course is we're dissecting how to make a system, right? The fundamentals of a new system, understanding how systems work within an organization. And when we say systems, it's more looking at it from a systems thinking approach, understanding that, your marketing is a system, your HR is a system, your finance is a system, your customer experiences system, and how do all those systems now, how do you look at it from an anti-racist lens? How do you change your perspective and the paradigm moving forward, and understanding that you have to be inclusive, you need to be diverse, you need to understand who your audience is. So from that community engagement, not only the community that you serve, but the community where you're located, where your business is, how are you helping the school systems and things like that. So it's really understanding and getting a, I don't want to say we're going down the wormhole. We're saying probably at ground level, but it's giving you the ability, if you want to go down the wormhole, you will definitely know if you want to go really into diversity, really into equity, really into community engagement, and really into inclusion. You can work with your HR team as an HRBP, a human resources business partner, or you can go into it. You can go straight into HR with this experience, if that's what you choose to do, or you can be a chief learning officer, because during these courses, you will also learn how to put together trainings on how to do these subjects as well. So it's not just a matter of we're going to just talk about it, but you're actually going to have to, if you go through the track, when you go through your adult learning and diversity course, you're going to learn how do because when we say adult learning and diversity, number one, the OLO track is geared towards adult learners, but we also know when you go into the workplace, you're working with adults. So how do adults learn differently than children, right? How does andragogy, for those of you out there, I'm using big words now, right? I'm showing my professor hat. How does andragogy differ from pedagogy? Pedagogy obviously is how children learn. Andragogy is how adults learn. So then how do you put a training together for the adults in organizations so that they can learn, especially in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, or whatever your training topic you want to be? You'll go through things like Panopto. Obviously, I think they're going to probably call on me if you want to create podcast trainings. We also just hired a phenomenal technology expert to work down at Fort Knox. She's big into VR. So if you want to get into VR and AR training, like we have like a subject matter expert on the OLO staff that's definitely going to help us improve in that area. So when you go into the workforce, you won't just to say, yes, I have a degree in DICE. You actually say, yes, not only do I have the degree, but I know how to put the trainings together. I know how to, do the assessments. I know how to know if they're learning. And oh, by the way, yes, I need to be in a leadership position. So hopefully that gets you a couple more dollars on your paycheck. So that's the DICE project.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. I can certainly say I'm super excited that this was launched, and I wish it was around when I was still in the program. Now it's a little too late, but I'm really excited for the future students to go through this.
The certificate is coming. I know that's a spoiler alert. The certificate is coming. We will be creating a certificate in DICE here shortly, but we do have to launch it and go through a couple iterations of making sure that we're hitting all our bullet points. But look here shortly for a DICE certificate from the University of Louisville.
Absolutely, will do. All right, do we want to go into some questions? Or you mentioned you had a spiel that you would go through?
Yeah, so I guess what the spiel I look at is when we're looking at the big three letters or acronyms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and just kind of what I've alluded to before. When we're looking at diversity is what I call your analytics, right? It's the analytics of what's happening in your organization. And sometimes, when you look at that mirror, it's not as good as you think, even though your company may be doing as well as you want it to, or your organization that you're applying for. So what I've always encouraged entry level, any worker, right? If you're looking at an organization, know the diversity that you're walking into, and know what that company or organization is requiring of you and what you're requiring of it. And so once you know the simple analytics, it's really simple. You just go to their about page and kind of look at their leadership and see, right? What does it look like? That can also help you when you're asking your interview questions or how you're addressing people, if you really want the job as well. I know in HR, we always want to know, from an organizational standpoint, how do we look to our audience? And so I think understanding that is key, right? How do you look to the people who are looking at you? Do they see, in an all white male staff? And to some degree that there's nothing wrong with that. And I say this from this standpoint. So when I first got out the military, my first real job, right, outside of the military, because I joined the military right out of college. So the military was my first real job. But once I had to understand like what taxes and all those things really are when they come out of your paycheck and how much like you really don't make. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation for another day. I worked at the American Legion, and when I worked at the American Legion, we were in the middle of doing a marketing consensus or census, wanting to understand who was doing what within the organization. And when we found out, and if you go to the American Legion, you look down the halls, right, they have these long leadership. And what we found out that it was true, right? It was, the moniker was, and I can say this, and hopefully no one gets offended. Our moniker was too old, too white, too male, too drunk, right? But clearly there was like this 30-year-old version of me working there at the time. So clearly I'm not white. I am a male. I partake in adult beverages every now and again, but I wouldn't consider myself a drunk by any stretch of the imagination. But if I look down our hallway of leadership for the American Legion, who had been around since like the 1900s and was like one of the very first military organizations who really opened up. They didn't discriminate, right? But however, their leadership didn't necessarily reflect that, but the organization did at maybe like your post level, because there are all black posts, there are Marine posts, because the posts are stationed like in Florida or Southern California. And so they were like, well, that doesn't reflect us. And I said, well, we can do two things. We can spend a ton of money fighting it, or we can lean into it and become really diverse, right? And you're saying, well, how can you lean into it diverse? Because they think we're too old. I said, well, you are, right? And they're like, but we're not old. We can still do things. But I'm like, the average person was like 68 or something like that. Like that. Nobody considers that young. So I don't. So you are too old. So we don't have to fight that. We were too white, right? They felt the organization was too white. And I said, they're just showing a reflection of our leadership. Right, too male. Okay, well, a lot of times we couldn't really control that because you are a byproduct of the military, and typically the military is more male than female. So why are you trying to fight that? And too drunk. I said, well, I mean, when most people think of an American Legion post, they don't really think of community outreach. They think of the local watering hole, right? It's where you go to get your $1 beer or whatever. So what my initiative was when I was the assistant director of membership for them, I said, let's lean into it. So we leaned into being too old, and we changed some of our programming, not so much that we were trying to fight the stereotype, but that we're supporters of of that. So American Legion Baseball, a lot of people have heard of American Legion Baseball. I said, let's lean into being too old. Let's lean into being the grandpas that support, or being those male adult figures that kids need to look up to, of how to do right, make right decisions. We added mentoring sessions to the American Legion baseball team. So there were so many things that I said, we can lean into being quote unquote too old, because an old person is considered wise, is considered the sage, yada, yada, yada. So we leaned into that. So we were too old, too white. I said, I don't know how we defeat that, right? And so I said, but we are, because that's typically what we did. So what do? We just changed a lot of our pictures. We changed our profiles. We advocated and promoted, at the post and the local level, a lot more minority leadership. Most posts then created kind of like their own diversity council, and it was led by, someone who was from a disenfranchised or disempowered movement. And so there were more African Americans, there were more Latinx, there were more, I can't think of all of them. I think we represented like 23 races when it was all said and done. And we had a big campaign about it. And so that was a big push. So then we said too male. So then under my leadership, when I was there, as I was leaving, we actually did have our first female national commander, which was cool. She's been the only one so far. I don't know if there's another one in the pipeline. I'm out of the organization now. And then Too Drunk. What we did for Too Drunk, I said, well, we pride ourselves in being an American supporter, right? We didn't want to support things that weren't American made. If you know anything about the American Legion, they're all about American made. Any of their products, they do cost a little bit more because they only buy from suppliers that produce things in America. Nothing is made overseas. And if it is overseas, obviously it's an offshoot of the American Legion. They don't really, and they won't push it. So what we did was we found a bunch of American-made distilleries who were looking to promote their beer, their liquors, and their wines. And then we started distributing those in as many American Legion posts as possible. And that doesn't mean you can't get, a Budweiser, Bud Light, or whatever. But if you really want to lean into it. So what we did was we found several posts in Virginia, Maryland, DC, Ohio, and Michigan. And we just went on a massive posts to push those out there. So that's what we did. So that's what I think. And I think that's what a lot of organizations sometimes need to do. A lot of times an organization will say, well, we're too white or too male or too this or too that, or we don't have enough women. I think sometimes what helps is if you actually take a consensus and listen to what the people are saying, and then figure out, do we want to spend a lot of money fighting it, or can we lean into it? And if you lean into it, sometimes there are great opportunities in leaning into being, we felt that, what can we do to not be too male? Well, then we got to promote and show that women are in our posts. Women can achieve leadership within the organization. It's not that we're going to spend money fighting it. Let's just, instead of putting money out there saying we don't, let's just find who we feel meet our structure and then push them and see what happens. Let the people vote. Right. And at the end of the day, it'll happen. And so that's what happened. And so the American Legion, even though they were losing membership at the time and still are, and there's nothing wrong with that, because what they do know is this: the American Legion knows that if you're 20, 30 something, when you get out the military, you want to go be a family guy. You don't really want to join a post. And I hate to harp on the American Legion, but that's the best example I have from my working career right now. And so it was one of those things where I felt that fighting something, let's change our redirection of our resources. So that was the diversity. From an equity standpoint, I think equity is really about, there's a picture, I probably should have put this picture up. There's a picture out there that somebody had sent me one time, and it just says that, hey, the goal was for an organization, they want to give everyone a bike, right? And most people think that if you have a bike, that you could give it to anybody and it would work. But the reality is, sometimes that's a great idea on the front end, but it's a horrible idea on the back end. Because what happens if you have people with disabilities, right? Like physical disabilities, like they're quadriplegic or paraplegic, right? They can't move their limbs. So giving some, it's kind of like a sign of disrespect to give that person a bike. But they do make bikes where those people, for people who have those disabilities or accessibilities. And so if you're going to say, let's give out bikes, right? And then what happens if, what I'm saying, you have like 4 retired NBA players who are 6'10" in your organization, and a bike is made for like a 5'11" individual. Like, it's kind of not going to work for that individual because they're too big, and it's going to be a gift of a gift or something. So when I say equity, I say when they sent me that picture of the bike, they're saying that there's some organizations that just give out bikes, and then there's some organizations that actually listen to their employees and know who their workforce is. And if you have a disability, you give a bike for the person that has the disability and that can work, and that they value your organization. Or you give a bike who's a 5'11" individual, or an average, quote unquote, average individual, a regular bike, and it works. And if you have someone who's 6'8" or 6'10", then you give them a bike with a bigger frame and it works. And that's kind of how your equity works. It's saying everybody has a bike, but depending on who you are, where you are, and what you have, you can now enjoy, and now you probably value your company a bit more versus just saying, they gave everybody a bike, but what am I going to do with the bike, right? And so that's kind of like the best analogy I have for equity, and I think that's cool. And then inclusion, I mentioned it before, is making sure everybody's at the table. I can't express how many meetings I've been in where that's the first question a good leader asks is everyone at this table that needs to be at this table? And then even after you end the meeting, you ask the same question, because now you've gone through a meeting and you've had discussions and you figured out, okay, maybe we are missing someone from IT. Maybe we are missing someone from this community. Maybe we are missing a representative from the LGBT. Maybe we are missing somebody from accessibility services, and we need to bring them into these conversations. And that way, when you do roll out this great grandiose scheme and this great grandiose plan, that everyone feels included, everyone feels their voices be heard. And trust me, I think most people do realize that there's no one product or service that fits everybody. But you do want to make sure that the product or service you're putting out, the organization you're working for, is a good representation, and say that, hey, we at least tried. It doesn't work with this product, and if we need to evolve it or move it forward or adapt it to a different thing, we can always do that. And sometimes I think that comes through what I call being on a part of an innovative team. And if you're on an innovative team, a learning team, then you're in a great environment and doing some awesome things. So that's my spiel for diversity, equity, inclusion. Do you have the analytics, right? And are you giving out the right resources to the people who need them? And then obviously, is everyone at the table so that's supposed to be at the table? That's my spiel for DEI right now.
Thanks so much. Do we want to go into some questions, if there are any, from our participants here about diversity, equity, inclusion? if you have any, you can unmute yourself, or you can even put it in the chat. We're monitoring, and then we can read it if you don't feel comfortable speaking or being on camera.
And I see where Dr. Herb put too drunk. And I, you know, it took a lot for us to really come up with that. But what we did, we took a tour. The American Legion sponsors, or is a big sponsor, big time sponsor with the Sturgis event. And what we found at Sturgis was clearly we know moonshine and all those things were in existence. But what we did when we were at Sturgis, we found out that there were a lot of people who like either knew or from back home or in Montana or wherever we were, that they were making their own beer. And they're like, they're making their own beer, or they're making their own alcohol. Why can't we put those in our American Legion posts and kind of lean into it? Now, people don't like it and they just don't buy it. And clearly, but then you leave it up to the people, you leave it up to your members to figure out what they like and don't like. So I thought that was very innovative. I think there were some people who hated me when I came up with that idea, but at the end of the day, I think the suppliers really liked me because they made a little bit of money in the process. Jose, I see your hands up.
Hey, Dr. Owen, thanks. I have a question. So I think the World Health Organization recently published an article that they stated that 1 out of 5 people have some sort of mental disorder or some kind of mental health concern. And they didn't go into details of whether it's work-related or something genetic or biological. But when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do those two things tie into each other? Or do you even see them tying into each other?
They totally. So I'm working with Dr. Campbell, and we're working with the Air Force right now of creating a disability ERG. But it's built towards that. Not so much do you have a physical disability. And obviously we know that clearly there are certain recommendations that certain non-military personnel in the military, you probably won't have that type of disability. But she's a huge advocate for it. I'm working with her. So the Air Force now will have an ERG, Employee Resource Group, or what the Air Force military calls an RG, that will deal with people who have disabilities. And we won't label them because sometimes there's still not a true transparency that people want to openly admit they have a disability. So, but what we've also done with this Employee Resource Group is we've said, if you're the parent, right, if you take care of a loved one, if you're the sibling of someone who has any type of these disabilities, because what we were trying to create is a community of care. Because although you may not feel comfortable saying you have a mental or what we would call a neuro disability, that doesn't mean that there's people out there who take care of people, who have great resources, who have great alternative ways to handle those things. So I think moving forward, I think you'll see more neuro disability outreach in the future. I'm still kind of new to it. She's like a seasoned pro in this. So I'm still learning from Dr. Campbell and how she's actually rolled it out. The Employee Resource Group, when we started within Headquarters Command, it started off with 15 people, which was amazing because that's 15 leaders in the Air Force that are admitting that either they have some type of disability, neuro disability, or they're supporting someone in their family or someone close to their circle has one. The last number count I had, it was over 56 members, and they're pretty active in sharing ideas. So I think, Jose, I think the World Health Organization is spot on. I just think there's going to have to be a bit more conversation where people can feel comfortable saying that they have a neuro disability or support someone, right? Because sometimes that's still, I don't know if a lot of people feel comfortable sharing that information. Much like I guess it's much like the LGBT when it first started out, it wasn't comfortable to admit that. But over time, it became more and more commonplace in the workplace. So I think neuro disabilities are going to be more and more common. We're already aware of ADHD, IEPs, 504 plans within the university and K through 12 setting. So I think it's only fair that we bring those into the workplace.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I totally agree. That's something that kind of sparked my interest in looking into the future. When you mentioned like looking for jobs and organizations that support you financially, that's great. That's what we look for. But there has to be a little bit something extra in taking care of family members, the community of care, as you mentioned it. I think that's definitely something that would be a driving force for employers.
I think more HR companies should promote ERGs if you have ERGs and what you do. I think in my opinion, I think that's just as good a selling point as the salary, as the benefits, because when I walk into this company, maybe I am taking care of an elderly parent, right? Does anyone else here do that? Or we created a WMD ERG, working moms and dads, right? And so, and they've actually turned that into like their own babysitting network, right? So out of our working moms and dad resource group, it's turned into like a babysitting network, because I'm a working mom and dad. I'm in the Air Force or I'm in the military. And what happens is, okay, I have a 17-year-old who needs a job, but there's also this family that has like a 3-month-old or 3-year-old, and they want to go on date night. So we've kind of, it morphed into its own network of babysitting, but it was created because we wanted working moms and dads to be able to communicate. Teenage moms, everyone wants, how do you deal with a crazy teenage girl? How did you deal with sending your kids to college? How do you deal with, I have a 24-year-old who went to college. We spent all this money at a private institution and they're back home because they can't find a job. And so there are these working moms and dads that are having these conversations and supporting one another to let them know, hey, it's okay, or this is how we got through it, or, Kroger's is hiring or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think ERG. So for those on this call, I think when you're looking at when you take your roles in HR, I think promoting your resource groups is going to be huge, as well as promoting your salaries moving forward.
All right, we do have a question from the chat, and it says, since we are in higher education, what do you think are some of the DEI speed bumps we're running into, and how can we bridge the gap?
Oh, wow. I think that is a overarching question that is very difficult to answer. So let me see if I can break this down. What do I think are some of the DEI speed bumps? So here's what we're running into, right? I think it's I'm sure you guys are, everyone, I say you guys, so please don't be offended. That is a habit I am trying to break, because I know everyone here is not a guy. I get it. I think everyone's aware that VR, AI, is taking over or being very much implemented into the world already. What I do think is that we already notice that there are biases in those technologies. Sometimes they don't recognize certain facial features because they're not created from people who have diverse experiences or inclusive experiences. So I think that's that's the next big wave. If we don't fix this technology deficiency, I think it could come back to bite us in the rear end, and it's probably going to do it at the most inopportune time. So I think there's a big technology wave that we have to make sure. And I was talking to Dr. Faye Jones on a podcast, but also offline. And that's one of her things is it's when you're trying to be a DEI institution or organization and you're trying to promote these things, then you also kind of have to do your due diligence in the tech companies that you're working with, and are they supporting those efforts? Because if you're, let's say, for instance, and I know the University of Louisville, as great as it is, it's not an HBCU, right? So it's saying that, okay, Blackboard or Panopto may work really well at a PWI, but does it work, for an HBCU institution? Because that's a tech software that a lot of people use to figure out, does this work and does this modify, and does it work with our target audience? So I think asking some of those questions. So Lance, I think that's one of the speed bumps. It's coming into understanding, how does technology and DEI merge, and how do we make it work? Because again, and I say this from consulting with the Air Force, in that STEM field, it's not a high minority or underserved industry right now. So if the industry isn't really quote unquote sexy, right? I don't know how we fix that, because we're going to run into some even more speed bumps as we become more and more dependent on technology. And then how can we bridge those gaps? I think it's just going to have to come through communication. It's going to come through outreach. It's going to come through training. Just kind of what I picked up. It's going to come through promoting ERGs and saying, listen, we're looking at our board and we don't have this, we don't have that. How do we become more inclusive? How do we get more people at the table, even if they don't want to be on the board, even if they're not in a leadership role? Are we listening to them? So I think that's the only way. Obviously I'm a professor, so I believe education is probably the only way you're going to fix it. But I also realize that there are sometimes some inequities in education as well. There's inequities in certain degrees. There's certain inequities in certain career fields and career choices. But I think that we play a part in that too. And by I say we, I'm saying me, you, everybody, because just because you want to be, an electrical engineer, doesn't mean we can't make that an attractive field. I think it may require more work, but I think we can make it an attractive field and saying what it really does and why it's really needed. Data analytics. It's not. I mean, I'm a data analytics nerd behind closed doors, but it's not a. I mean, let's be honest. It's not a very attractive field to just look at a screen of Excel or a spreadsheet and trying to understand how to make formulas work and then plug them into Power BI to make a fancy graph, right? Like you kind of have to have a degree, and I'm sure nerd is probably not a very politically correct term, so I'm sorry. I just use that, but it's one of those things that you just have to kind of be aware of. How do we make certain degrees or degree fields more attractive? So I think we have to do a better job in marketing and leaning into that, because I think if you're an entrepreneur or if you're in the College of Business, let's be honest, it takes care of itself. So to spend, an absorbent amount of our budget for the College of Business, and nothing against the College of Business, I mean, it speaks for itself, right? Anybody can, you're on Twitter, you're on Power BI, you know how this stuff works. You can go to YouTube, but I think some of our less attractive fields that we know that the world is going to need, I think we got to do a better job of marketing those. So those are the speed bumps, and I think educating and promoting them is the best way to do it.
I actually have a question.
Sure. Yes.
That kind of is similar. It's related to higher education. So we are a student chapter, obviously, and I was wondering if you have some tips on how we can take an active role in addressing these speed bumps as students, and not just as emerging HR professionals or already practicing HR professionals, but what can we do as students? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so now you're making me put my student affairs hat back on. So before I jumped into academic affairs, I was a director of residence life at 3 institutions, and we did phenomenal work. And the first hire I did in all of those positions was hire someone who was over what we call res ed or residential education, because I felt that was very important for our student organizations to promote what they're doing. So how do you, from a student organization standpoint, how do we do that? I think we, embrace what we are, right? I think you lean into, if you're human resources and we know that major just doesn't have a lot of people, then I figure out, then we say why. And then I say, how do we grow it if we want to grow it? Or how do we, Dr. Hurd is probably gonna hate me for saying this, but it's like, then if you can't get a lot of people, and there's nothing wrong with that, then my question would be how do we then become the Ritz-Carlton of the SHRM networks in the country, right? How do we become that place that, even though we're not big in numbers, because let's be honest, how many people on here want to spend $400 a night to go to a hotel? Exactly. No hands went up. That's what I thought, right? And some of us have pretty good jobs. But nobody wants to spend it, right? But that doesn't mean we don't want a Ritz-Carlton experience, right? That doesn't mean we do want a clean bed when we go into a hotel room. We do want a working toilet, right? We do want, hopefully the air conditioner works, even though, right, you get what you pay for sometimes. So it may look like it's in the wall, but it may not work. But nevertheless, it's an expectation. It's a bare minimum. But we do know that there's a bare minimum that our expectations is meeting. So then the question is, are we meeting the bare minimum of expectation? Are we meeting regularly? Are we meeting consistently? And then at the end of the day, how about we make a pact that everyone in this small organization, we go out and be the best people we can be, get the best jobs we can be, and we then promote, right, our SHRM organization like nobody's business, because that's really all the Ritz-Carlton does. They don't do anything spectacular. Their mantra is, we're ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. That's it. That's how they built the whole business, right? Something very simple. So it's just saying, how do we become a student organization that, attracts or, whatever, builds upon the expertise of students trying to enter into the degree field? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, are we promoting who's been here before? Right? Like, are our predecessors, our alumni, are they doing great in the HR world or in the world in general? And then promoting it like nobody's business, and then saying, this is what you get when you come to this organization. We may not be the biggest organization, right? But we will be the best organization. Ritz-Carlton. We can do a lot of offline talking if you want to do about that. I've studied the Ritz-Carlton immensely, so.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
I had a question.
Sure.
To my, the example that you gave, really awesome. What do you recommend that we say in response? It could come up in class, it could come up in casual conversation, like this group or this organization is too white or too old or too young or too female or too male. Like, what do you say to those comments that I guess are getting more at the D part? Anyway, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I think that what I've learned, especially since I've been working at the University of Louisville, and I asked this question. If you go back and listen to the podcast when I was interviewing Vince Tyra, the athletic director at U of L, he said the one thing when he walked into his organization, he realized there was a lack of transparency. So I think you have to, when you meet with your senior team in an organization and saying, do we want to spend all of our energy fighting it? Or do we want to spend all of our energy, improving it, right? Accepting, yep, we are too old, too white, too male, too drunk. We're not going to argue with that, because if you argue with it, the problem you're going to do when you go down that wormhole is, like, if you were at the American Legion, all they got to do is look at our past leadership. I can't defend that, right? So it's saying, okay, I'm not going to fight it. I'm going to lean into it and say, yes, we were. However, we're changing, right? We're trying to be more inclusive. How about you give us some ideas of some solutions of how we can fix that? Do you have, is there anybody should we bring in, a minority, a Black speaker, a Latinx speaker, a LGBT speaker, or whatever? Do you know somebody that can help us solve this problem? So I think we go from being I think you're problem aware, but maybe you're just solutions driven and saying, how do we fix it? We're driving towards a solution. We accept who we are. We accept, this organization may be too white or maybe too female or whatever the case may be. But then we also know that, the world is changing and we're trying to get more people to hear our voice. So I think you just kind of have to lean into which way you want to fight. Because I just think that when you're fighting what people already know, I think it's just you can't win in that situation. If you're trying to recruit or if you're trying to improve your organization, I just think that's a lose-lose situation personally.
All right, do we have any other questions?
I'm so glad that I don't see Dr. Bird Pollard asking questions, because I'm sure I can't answer anything she asked me, just FYI.
That is totally not true.
That is 100% true. So if I'm keeping Dr. Bird Pollard quiet, I'm happy. I'm excited. I'm jumping for joy. I'm just counting down the minutes till I get out. No, I'm just joking.
You are doing an awesome job.
Let's see.
We actually do have another question there. It's organizations such as U of L have begun including questions related to DEI for candidates to respond to in the interview process. Are there any particular DEI focused questions or employee selection instruments that you have seen elsewhere that are being used or would recommend?
Wow, that's a loaded question as well. And I'm not an HR expert, right? So I got my degrees in organizational science and organizational leadership. So I have relied on my HR friends to say, unless policies change, sometimes those DEI questions can sometimes get you into some sticky situations. The instruments I've seen used are typically ones for onboarding, because I think there's just a legal safeguarding behind, once a person's kind of an employee, you can kind of do some things. What I have found particularly interesting is not so much how people enter the organization, but it's what their feelings are when they leave the organization. It's those exit interviews that are critical, but those are very tough I'm sure many of you are well aware, those are really tough to get when someone leaves a company, because clearly everybody doesn't leave because they found a better job opportunity. Some people are actually forced to leave. So, but those are some of the best information you can get. I think that I can share this. I believe I can share this information. If not, oh well, I'll get dinged. But so like for the Air Force, for example, a lot of female on the civilian side, a lot of female civilians were leaving the organization because they felt they weren't getting promoted. But that came out through the exit interview. It didn't come because they were happy to get the job, right? Who is it? Yes, I'm not unemployed, right? But then it's like, hold on, I'm not getting promoted while I'm in this organization. Well, let's be honest, that sucks, right? So then it's like, well, you take that information you learn and you do displace it to another organization because they're going to make you a manager, a supervisor, give you a huge pay raise, you've learned how to. So I think from my experience, Dr. Craddock, I think it's the exit interview that's the most important, not so much, or maybe a climate survey of while they're employed are most important. I don't know if you're getting it on the front end as much as you're getting it in the middle and on the back end, because as time changes, organizations should change as well. But I think the best information I have seen has been on the back end. I don't think I've gotten too much on the front end, and I don't even know if that's even good information on the front end, because if you on the front end, I think you can mask your DEI work with, well, I hired a woman, right? Or we hired someone from the LGBTQ community, or we hired someone from the Latinx community. Like, I think you can mask it with your diversity statistics on the front end, and so they can just or it's kind of like, for those of you who are athletes who follow sports, it's like the Rooney Rule. Well, I interviewed a Black coach. Well, that doesn't mean you have to hire one, right? Even if he was or wasn't the best candidate, we don't know. So I think just there are some of those small intricacies that need to be addressed, where I think you can run into them on the front end, but when someone's leaving the organization, they can tell you the truth. Even if they were fired, they will tell you the exact truth. I hated this organization. This is why I kept coming to work. I mean, no one else came to work. My boss didn't come to work. I don't know why I got fired, right? No one, like, who comes here? Who's here at 9 o'clock? Nobody, right? So I got fired. So now it's in taking those into great consideration. So exit interviews are the best information from my perspective, from where I sit.
All right, and Dr. Hurt actually commented on this question and said, a good selection question can be, organization is committed to being anti-racist. Can you provide some examples where you have worked to be anti-racist? I think that's a good example, and that kind of ties back to our webinar, I think it was last month, to show me your competencies, how like show examples of how you behaved in the past that illustrate that.
Well, yeah, I think that those questions are great today. I just don't. I mean, I guess for me, I always wonder, like, how much experience does someone really have with that? Mm-hmm. That's always been my caveat when I'm on a search committee. Yes, I think those are great questions. I want to ask them. We have to ask them. They're tough. They're challenging. They put you on the spot. They light a fire where they're supposed to light the fire. But then I always want to know, what is there something we're looking for when we get that answer, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because what if they say, like, I don't really have a lot of experience being in an anti-racist environment? So then I feel like if we do hire that candidate, it's our job, right? That's the HRQ, right? We need to have something in place, some training in place, that we train them what anti-racist behavior is or looks like, or what this organization considers to be anti-racist. Because I think that is the key that I think is missing in a lot of places. They may say, I haven't had that experience, but I guarantee you they've had one. They just may not even know that it was one.
All right, now we are coming up on the hour, but we do have one last question, if you still have the time for us, Dr. On.
Yes.
Okay, and looks like, what have you found or seen to be less visible groups where discrimination is still not called out as much?
What have I seen as less discriminable groups?
Yeah, the question is also, I think, from Dr. Hurt. Do you want to comment on that, Dr. Hurt?
Oh, I see it.
Yeah, any groups in particular that anyone here, with your expertise, that you've seen are less visible, as far as where people are less willing or even aware to call out discriminatory types of comments about the group. Well, as an example, when I was in graduate school, some of my faculty were doing research that they called geezer research. And so they were really interested in older employees and the barriers and challenges faced by older employees. and their point was that that particular group, it's still kind of acceptable to discriminate and to say comments about them. And I think we hear a lot now about, millennials and ha ha ha, how awful they are or whatever. So have you come across particular, race, color, creed, religion, age, over 40, sex, disability, and all the different groups? Have you seen some that are less visible? And you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So clearly, I think neurodisability is probably leading the forefront, in my opinion, on that right now. I also think that there probably is. This is the first generation with 4 working generations and going on 5 that can be in the workforce at the same time. So I think that there's definitely going to be some ageism going on. I haven't heard that as much. I guess it would probably just depend on the position that someone is in an organization of where they are. Because again, I still think there is, when people see an older individual in a position, they kind of give it a little bit of respect, unless there's a reason to question it. Like if someone sees an 80-year-old janitor, there's going to be way more questions if they're the actual true entry-level janitor versus someone who's like the supervisor over janitors. So I think that there's something with that. Another group that I think, and I don't even know if I call it a group. So with the military, we have now created, or with the Air Force, we work with the Army too. We've created what we call communities of interest. So community of interest differ from employee resource groups, because what you want to do is get those small groups of communities together that share like passions. So those COIs, what we call them, I think those don't get enough attention. So because there are a lot of people, and I say this working with so I'm working with the Air Force, and so I report to a person who reports to the general of the base. And so our COIs don't get enough attention because not every, I don't think people see them as what they need to be. So I think there's a community, there's people who need breakout groups, who need relief from. So if you're so how can I put this? If you're in the Air Force, if you're in the Air Force Research Lab, right? So you do work not only for the Air Force, but for Space Force as well. So there's this, but then they also need a break. So their breaks are what we call communities of interest. So there's chess groups, there's spiritual groups, there's all types of these little communities that people need to get together. So what I think is that we haven't done enough work to emphasize those communities. So do you like fishing? Because there's a group of people who like fishing. Do you like horseback riding? There's a group of people who love horseback riding. I would be definitely part of that community of interest, but there isn't one. So are there people who value their spirituality, like prayer time? They don't want to spend their breaks like gossiping they want to spend it like praying or meditating or doing those things. So I think that, in my opinion, those COIs need more attention, because that is really what re-energizes, I feel, people to get more excited about their work. If I know I can come to work and I'm a highly spiritual person, and I can take my lunchtime or all my breaks, and there's a meditation room or a prayer room or a place I can, read the Bible or the Quran with other people, I think that motivates you to keep going back for that next half of the day. So in my opinion, Dr. Hurd, I think I would love to see COIs get more exposure, as well as employee resource groups.
Thank you.
Long answer for a short question, but geez.
All right, we're nearing the end of this webinar. I do want to say thank you so much, Dr. Owens, for taking the time to speak with us today and answer all of our questions and talk about this very important topic. And also to everyone who joined, thanks for participating and asking questions. I think that is always the first and the best step to engage in these conversations, and hopefully make an impact.